What would you do if you found a strange creature gasping for life on your porch in the middle of a storm? Ruth Calder, a 67-year-old war nurse turned recluse, took it inside, without knowing she had just rescued an abandoned baby Bigfoot. But this creature didn't scream or attack. It was trembling, injured, and its eyes, those eyes, looked like they belonged to a lost child begging to be loved. Ruth had once lost her own daughter in a fire she blamed herself for, and she'd lived in silent penance ever since. But this time, she couldn't walk away. You'll witness a story of raw healing, hand-picking maggots from its wounds, building a bond deeper than species, and the heartbreaking choice to let go when the forest came calling. Years later, a security camera caught a towering figure returning a lost little girl, wearing around its neck a worn scrap of leather stitched with the letter S. Solace had come back to repay the woman who once saved its life. If you've ever lost someone, this story will remind you, some love never disappears, even in the deep woods, even in legend. The rain came like it always did in October, uninvited, sideways, and steady. It whispered against the tin roof of the cabin like fingers drumming on a closed coffin. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a crow called once and went quiet. Fog pressed against the windows like a secret begging to be let in. And inside, lit only by the trembling glow of a stubby beeswax candle, Ruth Calder wrote. The ink bled slow from her fountain pen, just as it had every night since '74. Same brown leather-bound journal, same cramped cursive, same aching silence. October 19th. Frost came early, sliced the herb garden clean. Murrow didn't stir until noon. Chest sounds worse. Murrow, the old blind cat, curled in the cradle of Ruth's lap like a threadbare sock, his breaths shallow but steady. His left ear twitched now and then, catching ghosts only he could hear. Ruth didn't pet him. She just kept writing, her lips pressed thin, her sweater sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Every so often, the candlelight flickered enough to reveal the framed photograph on the shelf, edges warped from smoke, a child's face half faded behind the glass. She paused. Her thumb hovered just above the ink. Her breath caught on something unseen. Then it came, a sound so thin it almost didn't exist, like breath pushing through a throat half closed with fear. Not quite a moan, not quite a cry, something in between. She froze. There it was again, barely audible over the rain, a whimper, high-pitched, wet, weak. She stood, slow and stiff, her knees cracking like old wood. Murrow didn't stir. The sound came again. This time, she followed it. The front door groaned open on its warped hinges. Rain hissed through the crack. Cold bit her instantly. She stepped out, one bare foot on the damp plank, lantern raised. Just beyond the porch, kneeling in the mud, was something that didn't belong. It was hunched, shivering, arms wrapped around itself. Small, but not small like a child. Covered in soot-matted hair, burned away in patches. The left leg twisted in a wrong direction. Steam lifted from its body like breath from an open wound. And the face. Oh God, the face. Not beast, not man, not child, but something that made Ruth's stomach lurch like she'd just walked back into that night. That night. The fire, the smell, the scream. Her hand trembled. The lantern nearly slipped. The creature looked up. Its eyes didn't shine red like an animal's. They were dim, clouded. The right one fully silvered over, the left dark and wide. It blinked once, then twice, then collapsed. Ruth didn't run, didn't call for help, didn't scream. She just stood there, rain dripping from her lashes, the hem of her wool dress soaking up mud. Finally, she moved, dragged the old wooden snow shovel off the wall, slid it under the creature like a stretcher, and with a grunt, lifted. It was heavier than it looked, limp, fevered, covered in scratches. Its breath rattled in its throat like a clogged drain. She laid it down inside, on the old rag rug by the stove. No blankets, not yet. Not until she understood what this was. Instead, she slid a chipped tin cup of warm goat's milk across the floor, letting it stop just an inch from its cracked lips. The thing didn't move. She knelt, watched it the way a person watches a locked door jiggle from the outside. An hour passed. The candle sputtered. Murrow stirred once, sniffed the air, then tucked back into himself like something best left untouched. Then movement. A single twitch of a finger. A flex of muscle beneath scorched fur. Its nostrils flared, took in the milk, but didn't drink. Ruth sat cross-legged now, close enough to feel the heat radiating off its body. Her eyes didn't leave its face. She could still see her daughter there, not in the features, but in the fear. The silent, suffocating panic. The helplessness. She whispered, not to it, but to someone long gone. Forgive me for what I didn't do. The wind scraped the windows. She reached out, slow, deliberate. Her fingers hovered above the creature's hand, gnarled and blackened at the knuckles. Then, it grabbed her. Not hard, not clawed, but tight. Its palm, fever-hot and shaking, wrapped around her fingers like a drowning child clutching a branch. And it moaned, just once. Not animal, not gibberish. Ma-ah. A syllable broken like a bone. Ruth's mouth parted, but no sound came out. The room went still again. So still she could hear the crackling of wet wood inside the stove. So still she forgot to breathe. Outside, the rain kept falling, but it sounded farther now, duller, as if the forest itself had taken a breath and held it. She didn't pull away. Not this time. She let it hold her hand. And for the first time in 15 years, Ruth Calder felt the weight of a small body beside her, a body that wasn't burning, just breathing, barely, and somehow, impossibly, begging to stay. The fire in the cast-iron stove had died down to coals, and outside, the rain had slowed into a mist that clung to the trees like breath on glass. The cabin was dark except for the dull orange glow from the hearth, and a single candle flickering on the shelf above Ruth's bed. She sat hunched at the edge of the cot, both hands resting on her knees, watching the creature breathe. It had not moved in hours. Its body trembled beneath the old wool blanket she'd thrown over it. Wet patches seeped into the fabric where the wounds hadn't clotted. The fur, if it could be called that, was burnt in places, curled and flaked away like scorched paper. Its chest rose and fell with an uneven rhythm, as if each breath cost more than it had to give. It didn't drink, didn't eat. It had not opened its eyes since she'd brought it in. Ruth wasn't even sure if it could. She dipped the cloth into the bowl of warm vinegar water and wrung it out over her palm, slow and quiet. Then she reached over and pressed it gently against its forehead. The cloth had once belonged to her daughter. She hadn't touched it in 15 years. It had sat, folded and forgotten, in the drawer of the old cedar chest beneath the window. She never opened that drawer, not until tonight. The moment the fabric touched the creature's brow, its body shuddered. Not from pain, at least not the kind you could fix. It was instinct, like it knew what it meant to be comforted, what it meant to be touched and not feared. Ruth didn't say anything at first. She just held the cloth there, let her fingers rest lightly on its cheek. The skin was rough, scarred, warmer than it should have been. Its breath rasped under her hand. Then she began to speak, voice barely louder than the rain against the roof. You know, she used to pick mushrooms down by the south slope. The little ones. Thought they were magic. Her eyes stayed locked on the creature's face. Used to call herself a witch. A good one. Said she'd make potions to heal squirrels. Even tried one on Murrow once. Poor thing smelled like sage for a week. Murrow let out a faint wheeze from under the stove, but didn't move. He hadn't approached the creature once. Just kept his distance, silent and wary. She'd sneak out at night with a flashlight, Ruth went on, her voice catching in her throat. I'd yell, pretend I was mad, but I'd always watch her from the porch, make sure she made it back. The creature stirred slightly, lips parting. A soft noise, a whimper or maybe just breath, escaped its throat. Its hand, thin and bruised, shifted across the blanket and gripped a fold of Ruth's sweater. Weak, but deliberate. She didn't pull away. "If your mama left you," she whispered, barely audible now, "then I can't do the same." She didn't know why she said it. The words weren't meant for it. They'd been trapped inside her chest for so long they didn't know who they were meant for anymore. The candle flickered as wind pressed against the windows. The trees outside moved like giants in slow procession. Ruth sat there for what could have been minutes or hours, her fingers resting on the creature's hand, her eyes on the dying fire. Then she noticed something odd, a smell, sweet, almost sickly, sharp. She leaned forward, furrowed her brow, and gently turned the creature's face to the side. And that's when she saw them, tiny white specks, squirming at the edge of its nostril. She recoiled, heart hammering. Bile climbed the back of her throat. She grabbed the candle, brought it closer, and looked again. No mistake. Maggots. She bit down hard, steadied her breath, swallowed the urge to panic. This wasn't the worst thing she'd seen. Not by far. Not after the war. Not after what came after the war. But it hit different. It always hit different when it was something small, something that couldn't scream. She reached for the tin basin on the shelf, poured hot water from the kettle, added salt, and grabbed the old tweezers she kept in a chipped porcelain cup. Her hands moved faster now, practiced, focused, the way they had when she was still in uniform. She dipped the tweezers in alcohol, then knelt beside the cot. The creature twitched as she leaned in, but didn't wake. With her left hand, she held its face steady. With her right, she began. 1 maggot, 2, 3. Each one wriggled as she dropped it into the water. She whispered as she worked. Not words, just sounds, like the ones she used to make when rocking her baby to sleep, long before the fire, long before everything stopped. The creature's breathing hitched once, then again. Its mouth opened in a silent gasp, then closed. Its grip on her sweater loosened, but didn't fall away. By the time she finished, the bowl was cloudy with blood and salt and things best not named. She covered it, set it by the door. Would deal with it later. She returned to the cot, sat on the floor beside it. Wet knees, shaking fingers, a dull ache in her spine that had nothing to do with age. The creature was asleep again. Shallow, broken sleep. But still, she brushed a clean rag across its brow. This time, not the old cloth. That one she folded and laid on the shelf. She didn't need it anymore. Outside, the mist had thickened. The forest swallowed sound like a mouthful of secrets. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Not the air, not the temperature. Something deeper. The kind of shift that happens when you finally look something in the eye and don't look away. Ruth reached for the lantern, turned the flame down low. Before she let the dark take the room, she whispered one more thing. Not a prayer, not a plea, just truth. I'm not leaving you. And for the first time in over a decade, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like promise. By the time the storm returned, the cabin had gone still again. But not the kind of stillness that settles after peace. This was the kind that held its breath, waiting for something to break. The creature's fever had worsened. Its lips were cracked, eyes rolled back, skin under the fur pale and clinging too tight to the bones. Each breath sounded like it might be the last. Ruth had done what she could. Salt compresses, onion poultices, vinegar rubs. The last of her penicillin, years expired but better than nothing, had barely brought the fever down. It wasn't enough. She could feel it in her gut. The same gut that once knew when a soldier wasn't going to make it through the night. The same gut that told her when to run from gunfire and when to stand her ground. And right now, it told her one thing. You have to move. Now. The blanket clung to Solace like wet paper as she bundled him into the old quilt her grandmother had sewn. She worked fast, one eye on the pulsing rise and fall of his chest, the other on the growing grayness outside. She could hear it again. The low rumble of thunder, not far off. The trees beginning to hiss. She hoisted him onto her back, arms wrapped under his legs, his body limp and too hot against her spine. Her knees popped in protest. Her boots sank into the wet ground before they even reached the gate. She didn't lock the door, didn't even look back. The path toward Marjorie's place wasn't a real road anymore. It had once been an old timber access trail, but that was years and 20 storms ago. Now it was more memory than anything. Mud swallowed her heels with every step. Twigs snapped underfoot. Branches lashed across her cheeks, wet and stinging. The weight on her back wasn't heavy, but it was wrong. The kind of wrong that made her legs feel like lead. The fever from the child, this child thing, seeped through the quilt and into her bones like a second storm. She gritted her teeth, breath coming fast. Her heart pounded, not just from the climb, but from something else. She hadn't walked this path in years. Not since the fight. Not since she told Marjorie never to come back. The memory stung more than the rain, but Marjorie had been a vet for 40 years. She'd saved things most folks would shoot without blinking. Wolves, owls, a fawn once crushed by a snowmobile that lived with 3 legs and a stubborn will. If there was anyone left in Oak Brush County who could see this thing for what it really was, who wouldn't call the state or pull a rifle off the wall, it was her. So Ruth pushed forward, one step at a time, boots sinking deep, spine screaming, but still moving. It took nearly an hour. When she finally saw the outline of the old green trailer tucked between 2 pine ridges, her breath caught. The lights were still on. Ruth staggered to the porch and banged her elbow against the door, too breathless to knock. It opened faster than she expected. Marjorie Skelton hadn't aged much. Still wore those thick glasses, same messy braid. But her eyes, once quick with judgment, softened the second they landed on Ruth, and then shifted downward. "What the hell?" "It needs help," Ruth rasped, throat raw from cold and silence. Marjorie didn't ask what it was. She just stepped aside. The room smelled of iodine and hay. Metal trays on the counter. A hawk perched in a cage near the window. Ruth laid Solace down on the examination table like a fragile relic. Marjorie stepped closer, hands already pulling on gloves. "Where'd you find it?" "In the mud." "What is it?" Ruth didn't answer. Marjorie pulled the blanket back. The breath hitched in her throat. She froze. It didn't look human. But it did not look human either. It's not a monkey. Too big. Limbs are wrong." She turned Solace's head gently, inspecting the burn pattern, the inflammation around the nose. When she saw the wound, she stepped back. "Oh my God, it's necrotic." "I know," Ruth said. "We need to clean it out now. If it spreads to the lungs, just do it." Marjorie didn't argue. She pulled out a tray of instruments, gave Ruth a look, one more time, like a silent agreement to forget the questions. Then came the anesthesia, the antiseptic. Solace whimpered even in sleep. When the needle pierced his neck, his back arched slightly, then went slack. Ruth stood near the table, one hand on his foot through the blanket. Marjorie worked fast. Tweezers, suction, a flashlight between her teeth. White grub spilled out in streams. Blood poured. Ruth flinched once. Then again, when one popped against the steel tray like a burst grape. She looked away, but only for a second. She had seen worse. But never from something that felt this close to a child. Tears stung her eyes. Not from grief, from something older. Something like guilt. Marjorie's voice cut through the silence. "This isn't an animal." Ruth didn't speak. "This isn't a hoax either. I've seen hoaxes. This is real. This thing's real." Still, Ruth said nothing. Marjorie leaned over the creature again, her hands steady but slower now. She was listening, and in the next second, so did Ruth. A sound, low and thick and deep, like air passing through a hollow chest. It came from Solace, even unconscious. Ruth's stomach dropped. She hadn't heard a sound like that in decades, but it was the same. The same tone, the same vibration, the same call captured on a reel-to-reel recorder in 1969, 20 miles north, in the same forest. Whitecap's ghost song, that was what the locals had called it. Marjorie backed up slowly, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "I did," Ruth whispered. Neither of them said what they were thinking. Not yet. Because in that moment, the forest wasn't just outside anymore. It had followed them in, and now it was breathing through the walls. The first time Solace opened his eyes again, it was just before dawn. The candle had burned down to a stub, and outside, the wind was sifting cold fog through the evergreens like a slow exhale. Ruth was asleep in the rocker, chin tucked to her chest, arms folded tight. The kind of sleep that never truly rests. The creature stirred beneath the quilt. His chest rose more evenly now, no longer ragged, and when his eye opened, the dark one, it didn't roll or twitch. It simply blinked, then blinked again. He didn't cry, didn't move to sit up, just watched the shadows along the beams. His breathing matched the rhythm of the old cat's purr beneath the stove. The silver eye stayed closed. That one, Ruth had guessed, was blind. But the other followed the flicker of firelight, the slow sway of branches behind the window. And when he turned his head just slightly, the quilt slipped, and a small, raspy sound escaped his throat, like a sigh imitating a word he didn't know. Ruth stirred minutes later, as if she'd heard it in her sleep. She moved to the bed without saying anything. Her hands checked his forehead. Cooler now. The infection had backed down, but only just. She watched him watch her. No struggle, no flinching. Just that tired gaze, unblinking like he was trying to understand who she was, or maybe what she was. She knelt down, close enough that her voice didn't need volume. "You stayed." His mouth parted, but nothing came. Still, his hand moved, barely, to rest against her wrist. That day passed slow, quiet. Ruth fed him with a dropper, slow and steady. Goat's milk thinned with water, a bit of honey, a pinch of salt. His throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes never left her face. By the third feeding, he reached for the cup himself. By sundown, he sat upright. Ruth wrapped a flannel around his shoulders and moved the cot near the stove. He stayed there, arms folded against his chest, like a squirrel guarding a wound. Murrow still wouldn't go near him, but he stopped hissing. Progress, Ruth figured. The air had changed, not in temperature. Something else, something weightless but noticeable, as if the cabin itself had shifted slightly, accommodating a second heartbeat. A presence too small to be a man, too scarred to be anything else. That night, while Ruth scribbled in her journal by lantern light, the creature sat up on his own, climbed from the cot to the floor with care. His steps were uncertain, but deliberate. He didn't speak, didn't groan, just stood near the table, watching her write. She looked up. "You hungry again?" He tilted his head. She reached for the same cup, filled it with warm milk, set it down by her feet. He took it this time, drank slow, clumsy, like a child who had once known how and forgotten. That's when she said it. "Solace, that's what I'm going to call you." She didn't explain the word. Didn't tell him it meant comfort, relief, the kind of peace that comes after a storm. She just said it once, firm. He blinked. Then, with a gentleness that made her chest ache, he placed the empty cup back by her shoe. Outside, the fog thickened. By midnight, you couldn't see 2 feet off the porch, and that's when Ruth saw it. She'd gotten up to stoke the fire, passed by the kitchen window, glanced out by habit. What she saw stopped her mid-step. A shape, moving, not fast, but tall, taller than any man. She stood still, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The shape passed behind the shed, shoulders wider than a fence post, legs like trunks. Gone in seconds. She turned off the lantern. Darkness settled heavy. She waited. Silence. Then she checked the porch. Nothing, but in the mud by the steps, prints. Not boots, not paws. Feet, bare. Massive. She stepped outside, breath clouding instantly. One print, then another, leading away. But one, just one, headed toward the door, and stopped, right outside the window. She knelt, pressed her fingers into the edge of the print. It was real. It was watching. The next day, she brought out the old trail cam, dug it from the chest under the floorboards. Still worked. 2 rolls of film left. She rigged it facing the yard. Another near the shed. Solace watched her from the porch, wrapped in the quilt. He didn't ask, but his eyes followed the wires, the blinking red, the way her hands trembled. That night he didn't sleep near the stove. He curled beside her chair instead. His hand rested against her boot. When the rain came again, it was quieter, like it didn't want to interrupt. Ruth sat still all night, one hand in her lap, the other gently brushing the singed fur on his shoulder. The next morning she checked the film. One frame showed nothing. The other, a blur, not enough light to see a face, but enough to see height. Enough to see arms too long for a man. Back hunched, head ducked low, like it was trying not to be seen but couldn't stay away. She didn't show Solace the photo. She didn't need to. That night she woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. She sat up, heart racing. No footsteps, no growl, just the door. When she reached it, he was outside. Solace, standing barefoot in the mud, under the pines, looking into the forest like he could hear something she couldn't. Then he raised his head and let out a sound. Not loud, not human. A soft howl, a question, low, lingering. It passed through the fog like a thread of sound. He waited, then turned and walked back to her, stopped at her feet, pressed his face against her thigh. She looked past him, into the woods. Something had moved, but not toward them. Away. She pulled him inside, shut the door, bolted it. He didn't fight her, didn't try to speak, just rested his head against her chest like a child who needed to know the thing chasing him had stopped. She whispered into his hair, "It's okay, baby. You're not alone." She didn't say it to him. Not entirely. She said it to the part of herself that still lived in the burned-down room, still reaching for a child she couldn't save. Now she had this one, and something else knew it. By the time dawn broke, the mud outside bore 2 sets of tracks. The second pair, nearly twice the size of the first, and they didn't walk past the cabin. They circled it, once, then vanished. But in the earth by the window, 1 handprint, 5 fingers, each as wide as Ruth's palm, pressed deep into the dirt, like something had stopped and listened. The frost came early that morning, hard, bit into the garden like a warning. Ruth woke to the sting in her fingers before her eyes even opened. The cabin was still, breath cloud cold, quiet like the woods had made a pact not to move. She rose slow, creaking like the floorboards beneath her, and went to the window out of instinct. No tracks. Not yet. Just that thick Oregon mist curling between the trees like it had business of its own. Solace was curled in the corner by the stove, one hand half buried in Murrow's fur, though the old cat still acted like it wasn't happening. He'd given up fighting the inevitable. Ruth lit the fire back up, heated water, made a bit of barley mash. Solace didn't like the taste, but he ate it, blinking between bites like it was a test he meant to pass. He'd grown steadier on his feet, learned to pull the latch on the front door, which meant Ruth had to put a coffee tin full of nails against it each night, just in case. Not because she didn't trust him, but because something else out there was starting to circle closer. She found more prints. Not his, larger, and not just by the window now. They were in the ash pit behind the cabin, in the creek bed, under the hanging wind chime that had gone missing 3 days ago. The metal pieces had been yanked clean off the twine. Just gone. She told herself it was raccoons, but she didn't believe it. That afternoon, Miles showed up. Long coat, rifle over the shoulder, boots mud-stained to the calf. He hadn't been by in months, but Ruth knew he'd been watching. The Rangers always watched this stretch of whitecap. He stepped up to the porch and knocked twice, waited, then knocked again softer. She opened the door halfway. "You lost?" she asked without smiling. "Snow's early. Thought you might have needed salt," he said. His eyes shifted past her just for a second. She knew he saw the kettle, the 2 bowls, the extra cot by the stove. "I've got plenty," she said, and made no move to let him in. He nodded. "Just checking." Some hikers up the ridge found blood on the trees, higher than a man could reach, said it looked fresh. Ruth didn't answer, just looked at him the way she used to look at wounded boys in triage who said they weren't hurt. Might be a bear, he added, slower now. Or something else. She held his gaze until he looked away. You be careful, Ruth, he said, stepping back off the porch. Things feel different this year. Always do when the ground starts freezing, she muttered, and closed the door. Solace was peeking from behind the curtain. When she turned, he flinched, just slightly, then stepped forward. Hand brushed hers. He didn't speak, but she could feel the question in his touch. Who was that? Someone who wouldn't understand, she thought. Someone who'd bring guns instead of gauze. That night, the temperature dropped into the 20s. Ruth threw extra wood in the stove, layered 2 quilts on the cot. But Solace didn't sleep there. He sat by the door, back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. At first, she thought he was afraid, but then she saw it. The way his head tilted, the way his fingers twitched. He was listening. She sat beside him, waited, and then she heard it too. A rustle, far off, then closer, leaves crunching, not wind, not squirrel, heavier. Ruth stood, stepped into her boots, grabbed the flashlight off the shelf. She opened the door slowly, light swinging wide across the trees. Nothing, but the hair on her arms rose. Behind her, Solace was trembling. Not from cold, from memory. She stepped outside, scanning the edge of the tree line. A few feet out, something glinted in the mud. She crouched down, aimed the light. Blood, not old, still wet. It stretched in a smear across the stones, up one of the thick pine trunks. High, 7 feet, maybe more. She followed it with the beam of the flashlight, then saw it. A clump of dark fur, tangled with leaves, too coarse for deer. She turned. Solace was still in the doorway. You know who this is? She asked, not really expecting an answer, but he nodded. Once. Tiny, slow. Her chest tightened. She looked at the trees again, and in the pitch between limbs, she imagined something hulking, wounded, dragging itself just out of sight. And she remembered something she hadn't thought of in years. Da Nang. Rain. Blood on concrete. A voice on the radio screaming for backup. She'd made a choice that day, to save the medic, not the corporal. She never said it aloud, but it was the wrong one. And the boy bled out behind her, whispering for a mother who'd never hear him. She hadn't run then, but she'd looked away. And now this child, this thing, had found its way into her life, asking her to do what she couldn't back then, to stay. That night Solace didn't sleep. Neither did she. He sat under the eaves, eyes locked on the tree line. By midnight, the fog was so thick you could barely see the end of the porch. And then he left. Didn't say anything, just slid the door open and stepped into the mist. Ruth scrambled after him, quilt in one hand, flashlight in the other. Found him kneeling beneath the old pine, knees soaked, arms limp. Rocking, barely. She wrapped the quilt around him, pulled him tight. Not tonight, she whispered. You're not alone. He didn't speak, but his body folded into hers like he needed her bones to hold him upright. They stayed like that, wrapped together in a circle of breath and night and silence. Later, when they came back inside, she collapsed on the floor, legs gone numb. He stood over her, touched her face. His fingers, burnt and small, brushed away one tear. That was all, but it was enough to break something open, not the pain, but the part of her that had long decided it wasn't allowed to ask for grace. He was giving it anyway. The storm held until dawn, and in the distance, behind the ridge line, something howled, long, low, and not alone. The frost never left that week. It curled under the windows, nested in the garden soil like bone-deep sleep, and whispered down through the white-capped trees in long gray veils. Ruth could feel it in her joints, in the cracks of the porch planks, in the way Murrow moved slower now, stiff and careful. Everything felt quieter, not safer, just waiting. Even Solace had grown more still. Not weaker, he was stronger now. He could climb onto the bench by himself. knew how to work the latch on the pantry. But his silences had changed. They weren't rooted in fear anymore. They were listening silences. Waited. Like something inside him was turning its face toward memory. He didn't sleep much. She noticed it first on Thursday. He stood at the edge of the clearing, bare feet in the snow, head tilted back. Not looking for stars. Listening. Like the trees were talking and he understood the grammar. When she called him in, he didn't flinch. Just walked back, slow and deliberate, and touched her shoulder before curling up by the fire. That same night, Miles returned. This time, he didn't knock. Just stood by the tree line until Ruth came out to meet him. His breath came out white and steady. Rifle slung across his back. He handed her something without speaking. It was a strip of hide. Thick, gray. Too clean to have been from a deer or elk. But it wasn't the fur that made her stomach lurch. It was the marks on it. 4 long gouges, like someone had raked a hand across leather and dragged nails deep into it. I followed the blood trail up through Split Ridge, Miles said. Ended at a downed cedar. Something big died there, real big. He paused. It wasn't the same tracks as before, not the one circling your place. Bigger, deeper. He looked past her then, toward the cabin. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark window for a long beat. You said you didn't have anything strange up here. I don't, Ruth replied. He handed her a crumpled map. The body's still up there, not much left. You should see it for yourself. She didn't speak. Take care, Ruth. Snow's coming hard this weekend. And he walked off. Ruth turned the strip of hide over in her hands that night. She didn't show it to Solace. She didn't need to. The moment she stepped inside, his face changed. He backed into the corner like he already knew what she was holding. Like some distant string inside him had been plucked hard. He whimpered, just once. And that sound cut through her deeper than the cold ever could. By dawn, she had made up her mind. They had to go. Not away, not to hide, but toward something. Toward the place where that blood trail ended. Toward whatever had fallen under that cedar. Because the weight of it was still dragging in Solace's bones, and she couldn't let him carry it alone anymore. She called Marjorie. Didn't say much, just enough. An hour later, her friend's old pickup pulled up the ridge, spitting gravel, heat sputtering from the vents. They didn't speak at first. Ruth just pointed, and they lifted Solace into the back seat. He didn't fight. Just curled into the quilt like a prayer. Whitecap swallowed them quickly. The trees grew taller the deeper they drove. Limbs crowding low, sun stripped out of the air like a memory. The truck jolted over roots and frost-heaved rocks, engine whining in protest. Solace stared out the window. His hand twitched every time they passed a broken branch, a scarred tree. He remembered. The trail ended at a slope of loose shale and moss-covered logs. The smell hit them first, sharp and metallic, soaked into the bark. Crows scattered when they climbed down, their wings black as burned paper. The body lay half-crumpled beneath a collapsed pine. Flies buzzed sluggishly around what was left. Ruth didn't speak. Marjorie covered her mouth. It had been something massive. Broad-chested, limbs like beams. But it wasn't the size that made Ruth's knees give. It was the hand, still clutching a scrap of fabric, torn, faded, brownish with dried blood. And on it, 4 deep claw marks. Familiar. Solace stepped forward on his own. He stood over the corpse. Said nothing. His eyes didn't blink. Then he knelt. Not fast, not broken. Like ceremony. He reached out and touched the hand. Not the fabric. The hand. The sky was silent. The trees, too. Ruth watched him kneel there. One tiny hand against a massive, lifeless one. And for a second, just a second, she swore she saw the same light she once saw in her daughter's eyes. Long before the fire. That stubborn will to understand something cruel without becoming cruel yourself. She stood beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. This was family, she said. Not a question. He nodded, then leaned forward, pressed his forehead to the back of the cold hand. and let out a sound, low, mournful, soft but strong enough to shake the frost off the leaves. Not a cry, not a scream, a call, and somewhere, deep in the ridge, it was answered. A return howl. Distant. Then another, closer. Then silence. Solace turned to Ruth, eyes wet, chest heaving. She didn't speak, just nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "They heard you." And as the trees settled again, and the cold wind moved through the hollow like breath through ribs, Ruth realized it wasn't just a body they'd found. It was the last tether to something ancient and fractured, something that still remembered how to grieve. The body stayed where it had fallen. They didn't try to move it. There was a reverence to the silence that followed, like the forest had closed a door behind them and expected them to sit quietly until it chose to speak again. The clouds moved low, stringing dusk through the branches before the sun even dipped. Ruth spread the tarp across the body anyway, not to hide it, but to guard it. From the cold, from the animals, from whatever spirit still lingered in that broken thing Solace had touched like blood knew blood. They built no fire. No one spoke much after that. Marjorie left before dark, with a whisper and a squeeze on Ruth's shoulder, like she knew whatever was coming didn't want witnesses. Ruth stayed. So did Solace. He didn't leave that body's side once. Not to eat, not to rest. Not even when the night grew sharp and brittle, and the wind came like something clawing against the trees. He knelt in the dirt and placed his hands over the tarp. Small hands, cracked at the knuckles, shaking not from cold, but from some grief too old for words. His head stayed bowed, and every now and then, a sound leaked out of him. Not a cry, not a moan. A breath with shape. A sound that didn't need translating to be understood as mourning. Ruth sat 10 feet away, arms wrapped around her knees, her coat pulled high, her breath ghosting in front of her. She didn't try to pull him away, didn't offer food, didn't speak his name. She just watched, guarded, held space. That was all she could give, until they came. It began around midnight, a shift in the trees. First, a hush, like even the frost held still. Then a rustle, then another. Pine needles whispering under unseen weight. Ruth felt it before she saw them. Her spine tensed, her mouth dried, but she didn't reach for her flashlight. Solace had risen, still small, still scarred, but he stood tall, shoulders squared like a sentinel. Shapes moved between trunks, not close, not fast, just there, half-formed, half-swallowed by fog and shadow. Tall, sloped shoulders, long arms. They didn't rush, didn't roar, they didn't threaten. They observed. 5 of them, maybe 6. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. Only one moved closer, larger than the rest, almost as tall as the fallen one under the tarp. Its gait was stiff, but steady. It stepped just far enough into the pale starlight that Ruth could see the outline of its chest, rising, falling, like it had run miles, but never breathed until now. It stopped 10 paces from Solace. He looked up at it, didn't flinch, didn't move. He just waited. The larger one didn't reach out, just lowered its head slowly, then bent, almost reverently. Its brow pressed to the earth, inches from the tarp. Ruth's throat clenched. There was no doubt in her mind now. This was kin, and they had lost one of their own. The others stayed back. 2 flanked trees, long limbs half-curled around bark, heads turning slowly between Solace and the tarp. They made no sounds, but something passed between them. Something unspoken, like scent, like memory. Then one of them turned its face toward Ruth. She didn't move. She knew better, but it didn't snarl, didn't hide. Its eyes found hers and held. Wide, ancient, painful, like it knew what she'd done, who she was, who she'd failed, and what she had tried to fix. Solace took a step back then, turned toward Ruth, eyes glassy, lips parted. But no words came. He glanced over his shoulder, toward the standing shapes, then back at her. And in that pause, something clenched inside Ruth's chest. He wasn't asking for permission. He was asking for strength. She stood, knees cracking, walked forward slow, stopped beside him. She knelt, took his hand, felt how small it still was inside her fingers, and she nodded. Once, he didn't smile, but his chest eased. His other hand reached up, touched her cheek, held it like he was memorizing the shape of her, then let go. He turned back to them and walked. Not all the way, just halfway. The large one stepped forward to meet him. They didn't embrace. They didn't speak. But the big one, slowly, like gravity had loosened its hold, knelt and bowed its head to Solace's level. Their foreheads met, soft, like a rite. And then, without sound, Solace turned, looked back at Ruth, and for a long breath, didn't move. She raised a hand, didn't wave, didn't reach, just held it up like a promise. "I forgive you," she said, not knowing if he could hear it or understand. "Please forgive me too." He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because after a beat, he took one step back, then another, then disappeared into the fog, not alone, but still looking back. And as the shapes faded, one remained, the largest. It stepped forward, past the tarp, toward Ruth. She didn't retreat. Her hands stayed by her sides. The creature stood before her, close enough that she could smell earth and pine and something old. Its breath clouded with hers, and then it lowered its head, bowed, not in dominance, not in threat, but thanks, and its forehead touched hers, a single wordless gesture, and then it too stepped back and vanished. Ruth stood there a long while, long after the sounds were gone, long after the air warmed slightly, and the trees resumed their quiet. She whispered into the stillness, "Go on, baby, don't come back for me." Then she sat, next to the tarp, laid her hand on it, and wept, not for the loss, but for the leaving, and the knowing that sometimes the hardest part of love is letting someone walk away whole. 10 years passed like fog through pines, slow, quiet, unannounced. The cabin still stood, but barely. Its roof sagged inward in the center, like old shoulders bent under too many winters. The porch had split along the grain and now leaned hard to the left, as if the house itself had started to exhale. Moss covered the north wall, thick and spongy, and the windows wore the grime of seasons no longer tracked by calendars. There was no electricity, no warmth, no name on the door, only silence. But someone had been here, that much was certain. The forest ranger was new, 27, fresh-pressed jacket, boots that hadn't yet learned the rhythm of Whitecap's mud. He'd been told not to stray too far past the loop trail, not after what happened the winter before. Some missing dogs, a hunter who claimed to see something. But curiosity tends to grow best where caution thins out. He saw the trail off the main path purely by accident. Deer track, maybe. But then he saw a human print, small, clean, recent. It led him through a snarl of alder and into the clearing. The cabin stopped him cold, not because of the way it slouched into the land, but because something about it felt remembered, though he'd never been here before. Still, the feeling pressed deep into his ribs, like a whisper you almost hear. He stepped onto the porch. The wood didn't groan. The door was latched, not locked. Inside, dust floated like smoke through a shaft of morning light. Empty shelves, cracked stove, a dried-out bunch of herbs still tied with twine, an old rocking chair, unmoved in years, the smell of cedar, and grief. He moved slow, careful not to disturb anything, not out of fear, out of respect. That's when he saw it, on the table by the window, a bundle of dried flowers, fresh, not from the season. The petals were bright, vivid, left there not more than 2 days ago. He looked around, suddenly aware of the silence pressing against the windows. Someone had come, still came. He turned toward the corner, and his eyes caught the glint of something on the far wall, a frame, dusty but not forgotten. Behind the glass, pressed neat and reverent, a handkerchief, yellowed with time, edges frayed, embroidered in tiny faded thread. One single letter, S. He stepped closer. A warmth bloomed in his chest he couldn't explain, like something ancient and aching had been waiting for someone to notice. Then he saw the marks on the door frame. Not scratches, not damage. Offerings. Small things, laid carefully. Pebbles, feathers, what looked like dried mushrooms arranged in a circle. At the center, a beetle. Wings folded, perfectly still. He turned to leave, heart beating strange in his throat. And then, just as he stepped off the porch, he noticed something new. Something out of place in a place that had stopped changing long ago. A set of prints. Large. Not boots, not bear, not human. They started at the edge of the woods, ended at the steps. No return path, and beside them, smaller prints. Human. Maybe a child's, only they didn't lead to the cabin. They led away, back into the trees. He stood there a long while, the wind curling around his jacket, the trees swaying above him in slow rhythm. He didn't follow. He didn't radio it in. Some places weren't meant to be explained, only remembered. Weeks later, a tape arrived at the ranger station. Unmarked envelope. Postage from nowhere. Inside, a weather-warped VHS with faded handwriting across the label. 120299, Oak Brush Outpost. They dusted off the only working player in storage and watched. The footage was grainy, monochrome, stationary. Security cam from the front porch of the outpost 20 miles south. Timestamp 2:14 a.m. At first, nothing but snow. Then, a shape. From the trees. Massive. Covered in fur. Upright. It moved slow, gently. Cradled in one arm, something small. Wrapped in flannel. A child. Not screaming. Not struggling. Asleep. The creature stepped onto the porch, knelt carefully, and placed the child in front of the door. It paused. Looked up, straight into the camera. Eyes bright, steady. Not afraid. Then turned, and walked back into the trees, vanishing into the fog like it had always been part of it. The footage ended. No one claimed the child. No one ever came forward. And though the department labeled the case unexplained, some of the older rangers said nothing. Just nodded, slow, as if they'd known all along that some debts don't need collecting, only honoring. Years passed. The cabin stayed empty, but each equinox, spring and fall, fresh flowers showed up on the steps, always arranged with care, never the same kind twice. And if you listened, just before dawn, on the coldest mornings when the frost painted every branch in silver, you could still hear it, a single distant breath, not wind, not animal, but something older, something watching, not to judge, not to haunt, but to remember, like the pines had never forgotten her. Not the woman who stayed, not the hand that healed, not the silence she kept so something else could live. They remembered, and so did he. Even if no one knew his name anymore, he was never alone, because neither was she. There are stories we tell, and stories that tell us. Some don't need a name, a face, or even an ending, because they don't belong to just one person. They echo through time, passed like whispers between trees, etched into the silence of places no map dares to fully mark. Stories like this aren't about heroes or monsters. They're about what we choose to do when no one's watching, about the quiet moments when the world doesn't demand anything of us. And yet we choose to offer something anyway. Kindness, care, mercy. At the heart of it all lies a truth we often forget, that even in the wildest, loneliest corners of this earth, compassion still matters. It may not fix what's been broken, but it offers warmth to what's still breathing. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes a single act of grace, given freely without reason or reward, can echo longer than 1,000 shouts into the void. We are taught to fear what we don't understand. But maybe understanding was never the goal. Maybe the point was simply to stand beside the unknown without running from it. To see something strange, something wounded, and still choose to kneel down, open your hands, and say, "You're safe here." Because healing doesn't always come in bright hospitals or polished prayers. Sometimes it comes wrapped in flannel, beside a dying fire, spoken in a language older than words. Sometimes it's two creatures, different in every way, simply learning how not to be afraid of each other. And maybe that's the closest thing to peace this world will ever know. In the end, the forest keeps its secrets, It always has, but it also remembers. The earth doesn't forget where kindness took root, where forgiveness was whispered into the dark. The wind carries it, the trees carry it, and if you're very still, very quiet, you might just hear it too. That soft reminder that what we do, even in the smallest moments, matters. Thank you for walking with us through this story. Through the silence, the snow, the smoke, and the soul of something bigger than all of us. If it stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel a little less alone, we invite you to share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, tales of mystery, humanity, and quiet resilience, please consider following, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss what's to come. There are more voices in the woods, and more stories yet to be told.